I will just get started. So professional relations with industry, how I teach about conflicts of interest issues was the title that Tom gave this. So this is the title that I use. And I'm totally thrilled to be here with you folks. This particular illustration, just get this, is called Bitter Pills. I thought that was a little bit of irony here, which will hopefully carry us through. So I have no financial conflicts of interest to declare. This is the U of T disclosure slide, by the way. So in terms of relative conflicts, relations with community entities, commercial entities are none. Potential conflicts within this presentation, none. Steps taken to review and mitigate potential bias would be something that people would normally fill out, but I do indicate my position because I do have my own set of biases. I do not meet with pharmaceutical representatives. I respect the important role that pharmaceutical companies play in the development of new medications and improving patient outcomes. I teach on this subject, helped develop the U of T standards, and created the module used for faculty reappointment across the university. So that's where I position myself. So what I would normally do if I were with a group of residents, I would ask them to commit on paper to each of these questions at the start and at the end. And in good old days, when I actually had people face to face, I would collect up the papers and see if there's any change. And I was always humbled by, by the apparent lack of change. But anyhow, I asked people, is it appropriate or helpful to meet with pharmaceutical representatives for the purpose of drug detailing? Is it helpful to use drug samples? And ask them if they plan to attend non-accredited pharma-sponsored educational dinners. And this kind of talk would be used across internal medicine subspecialties and some of the surgical subspecialties too. And I get various answers, and some people haven't thought about this at all, and some people have thought about this a great deal. So today, by the end of this session, you should be able to describe the pros and cons of relations with industry, particularly with respect to conflicts of interest, and reflect on your own position on relationships with industry. So I'd like to have the trainees really kind of hopefully think about what they plan on doing in the future and you know, recognize that if they do develop conflicts of potential for conflicts of interest, how that could affect their careers potentially. So we're going to do an overview of issues to navigate with teaching relationships with industry, I will call RWIs. And then if there's time, we can do some RWI scenarios. Where do you stand? I use the scenarios more for teaching with faculty as opposed to teaching with residents. So we'll see how our time goes. There may not be time for both of these. So let's start with overview of the issues to navigate relationships with industry. So first of all, just as background, even before then, is to discuss a little bit about guidelines and standards. So it's important to know that the Canadian Medical Association has a policy that came out a zillion years ago, that it's important to teach residents and medical students about the guidelines. And there should be medical curricula that explicitly deal with the guidelines by including educational sessions on conflict of interest and physician-industry interactions. There's also the AAMC task force, which is industry funding of medical education. And this was a very important task force that came up. It was over a decade ago. It's a large document. It's actually a really useful one. And that's what we use to develop the current standards that are used at U of T. So this is the U of T standards. It's called Relationships with Industry in the Educational Environment in Undergraduate and Postgraduate Medical Education. And this is what my job is for people who ask me to help out, to teach their trainees about. And part of that is the fact that we have to be teaching the trainees. So now that's a bit about background, why we're doing this, why I teach residents. I teach them because I'd like to teach them, but also it's actually mandated. So let's look at what the issues are. Like, why is this even an issue? Why are we even, asked to teach about this? Well, we know as doctors, our mandate is to minimize conflict of interest and avoid biased prescribing in order to maintain the trust of the public. If we lose our public's trust, if we don't perform our function because we're biased and we don't minimize conflicts of interest, then our mandate as a physician is really lost. But if we contrast this with industry's mandate, they have a very different mandate. Their job is to, hopefully in an ethical way, but their job is to sell drugs, to initiate and to retain customers, and to influence physicians' prescribing in order to have these outcomes happen. And these two conflicting mandates can set up conflicts of interest. So why would doctors even consider forming a relationship with industry? Well, there are doctors who use it for research, and there are some forms of research where, unfortunately, it is actually necessary. And when I'm teaching this, when I have the opportunity for a longer session, I bring in a faculty member from U of T who does basic science research that's translational with drugs that have been developed. And we've had a couple of people do that very successfully, and they talk about how they maintain arm's length and how basically the only way to have gotten the drugs to the table was to form this relationship with industry. And this is very different from the research that sometimes people in the community or other people at the university would do, which is much more questionable. Sometimes doctors consider a relationship with industry to learn about the products or to obtain samples for their patients. There also was historically an expectation of gifts from industry, and there's still some people who have that expectation, unfortunately. Sometimes people have a relationship with industry because they want to be a speaker or part of the audience at a CME event. And sometimes they believe that participating in the relationship will help industry develop better products. And each of these has its own major caveats and concerns. So to truly understand this, we have to look a little bit, delve a bit into the literature. And some of this is psychology, and some of it is just plain looking at the facts of how we prescribe. So for doctors, one important question is, particularly if we decide to form this relationship, is how can we be influenced? This is helped by understanding the psychology of influence. And then the question is, does this really happen? Is there evidence that this theoretical influence, in fact, is real? Understanding the industry, we have to know what is the cost of engagement. So industry spends a lot of money reaching out to doctors. And what does that mean for all of us as taxpayers, for instance, who pay into provincial coverage of drugs? And another question is, can the industry police itself? Because it does have ethical guidelines that are meant to be followed. Are they followed? Can doctors say, well, the industry will police itself. I'm not going to really worry about the conflicts because it's been taken care of. And then finally, what does the public think? Because if we lose the public's trust, it really, all the above doesn't matter. And is it possible to manage conflicts of interest? If trainees decide to develop a relationship with industry at many different levels that we can talk about, how successful can they be managing that conflict of interest, or is there always going to be concerns about potential biased prescribing? Okay, so let's take each of these issues and explore it a little bit. So how can we be influenced? So a conflict of interest exists when doctors' primary responsibility to the patient is influenced by secondary competing considerations such as personal gain. And in this one particular group, they ask whether physicians aspire to be viewed more like corporate salespersons or professionals beholden to the public trust. And this is in the All Gifts, Large and Small paper by Katz. So this is a second exercise I would do with the residents. I would say, so there's many contexts for potential influence. Can you name some of them? And then I would show these responses, such as, what about when pharmaceutical sales representatives do their visits, which are called drug detailing, samples, journal advertisement and prescribing software, attendance at pharma-sponsored meetings, participation in sponsored clinical trials, acceptance of gifts, and then there's the whole pharma-sponsored literature and guidelines. And I hopefully get them to come up with this list. And then I explore a subset of this with them. And I have a faculty member with me who does an excellent job. He's a psychiatrist on looking at the pharma-sponsored literature and guidelines. He actually refers to the therapeutics initiative quite at the end as one of the resources that people should be using. Okay, so let's move on to the psychology of influence. Let's really try and understand what is known in terms of psychology. So Katz outlines in the American Journal of Bioethics, sales savvy, so the famous food, flattery, and friendship that are used to try and derail physicians' prescribing habits. So food is the most commonly used technique to derail the judgment aspect of decision-making. Flattery, we're receptive to compliments even when we recognize the source's transparent agenda. And friendship is important for engendering goodwill and encouraging reciprocation for gifts received. And it is really, really hard to not fall prey, sounds like a bit of a dramatic word, but prey to these if you are in a relationship with a sales representative, because it's just normal human nature. There's also Cialdini's 6 key principles of influence, tricks of the trade, how salespeople will sell you things. And this isn't just for pharmaceutical representatives, it's also for cars and television sets and everything else. So there's the reciprocity, which is commonly used as food for the sales representatives. The liking, which is the flattery and friendship we talked about. Commitment and consistency. There's a sales closing technique where they say, and so will you try our product, blah, blah, blah. And if you say yes, even just to try and get them out of your office, you're more likely to prescribe it after that. There's social proof, or the bandwagon, everyone is using it, or authority, appealing to authority, Dr. Big prescribes this. So these are all potential ways that people can use to try and get somebody to do what they want them to do. So this is all theory. Does the influence actually happen? That's what we want to know. And that's what people will ask. So what do studies show? So an older, this is before my kids were even born, 1993, Letchen showed that there is an impact on physicians' knowledge. So this is if people who go to speak to pharmaceutical reps. Improved ability to identify treatment for complicated illness, that's a good thing, but an inability to identify wrong claims about medication, which is a bad thing. It also has an impact on physicians' attitude with respect to positive attitude towards a pharmaceutical rep, awareness, preference, and rapid prescription of new drugs. So ultimately, you get increased formulary requests for medications, non-rational prescribing behavior, increased prescription rates, prescribing fewer generics, and prescribing more expensive, newer drugs at no demonstrated advantage. Now, I found an interesting journal. It's the American Journal of Bioethics. If you look it up on January 12th, 2010, there's a whole journal that debates the ethics of relations with industry. And they also ask, can this be a good thing? Can good things come out of this influence? And there's a whole series that go back and forth. So the positive, so here Huddle says that behavioral economics view of the inevitability of unconscious influence is not proven. And Morin rebuts, saying physician as a fiduciary imposes a higher standard of behavior. So the burden of the proof should be on the doctor that there's no abuse. Rubin says it's good for the public for new drugs to be used, but Brody says it's unprofessional to spend time with detailers because there are other sources of information, and detailers are giving you gifts and setting up a conflict of interest. Such, and you go back and forth with the different articles. It's really quite fascinating, but it really does, in the end, come down to the influence not being a good thing. What about the concept that physicians are capable of judging for themselves? Well, it turns out, believe it or not, that doctors consider themselves more rational and critical than the average person. They even consider themselves more rational and critical than the average doctor. Denial, there's a denial for the potential for undermining professional objectivity. And this is proportional to the number of gifts received. Like, how could you not, really respond to this kind of data? Most doctors do not feel they are biased, but admit that other doctors' decisions may be compromised by conflict of interest. And for medical residents, 61% believe promotions didn't influence their practice, but only 16% believe that promotions did influence their colleagues' practice. So we all think that we're better than everybody else. And I think that's just a human tendency. So there's something called the self-interest bias, unconscious and unintentional self-serving bias. So an individual's judgments of what is fair are typically biased in favor of their self-interest. And if there's a vested interest in reaching a particular conclusion, our arguments are weighted to favor the desired outcome. So what about in real life? Does this actually happen? Does it actually make a concrete difference? There's a couple of papers I'll throw out, more recent papers. This is De Jong from 2016, Pharma Industry Sponsored Meals and Physician Prescribing Patterns for Medicare Beneficiaries. And the question was, is the receipt of pharma-sponsored meals associated with doctors prescribing the promoted brand name meal at higher rates to Medicare beneficiaries? So you get the pharma-sponsored meal. Do you prescribe their drugs more? So they looked at a cross-sectional study of 250,000 physicians in 2013. A single less than $20 meal caused an increase in promotion of the drug of interest, prescribing of rosuvastatin versus other statins, nebivolol versus other beta blockers, olmesartan versus other ACEs and ARBs, and desvenlafaxine versus other SSRIs and SNRIs. So in other words, the receipt of industry-sponsored meals was associated with an increased rate of prescribing the promoted brand name medication. And this is like a tiny, like not a fancy meal out somewhere fancy, we're talking a $20 meal. There's a second paper from Sharma in 2018 that looked at the association between industry payments and prescribing costly medications. It's an observational study using open payment and Medicare data. The question was, is there an association between payments made to physicians by industry and prescriptions for selected costly brand name drugs? So again, cross-sectional, there's no randomized controlled trials on this, which would be an interesting thing to contemplate doing. It's a retrospective study in 2014 and included over 500,000 physicians who prescribed one of 6 brand name drugs with less costly but similar effective alternatives. So there's a cheaper version. And they found that the adjusted odds ratio of prescribing 3 of the 6 specified drugs when they'd received industry funding went up significantly. And for the odds of prescribing 4 of these 6 specific drugs when they got money from that particular manufacturer went up even higher. So the conclusion was that physician industry financial relationship was associated with increased odds of prescribing costly brand name drugs of uncertain medical benefit. So this is not, many of you are from the Cochrane group, and you're looking for meta-analyses and randomized controlled trials. We don't have those, but this is still, I think, and it'll be interesting to get your opinions afterwards, pretty compelling data. So what else does the pharmaceutical company use to look at factors affecting the uptake of new medications? How can they get them up? Because when you have a new medication on the block, particularly if there's other ones that are already out there, how are you going to get it prescribed? Well, one way they do is to look for early adopter doctors who are interested in a therapeutic area. They may prescribe in clinical trials. They have a high volume of prescribing, and they target them. They do marketing effects of pharmaceutical companies, where they look to the budget that correlates with the uptake, and they found that detailing is the largest effect. And there's also something called prescribing contagion via professional and social interaction. And early entry in combination with substantial market share would render late entry irrelevant. So you want to get there early, you want to get the early adopters using it, you want to get your marketing out with detailing to the right people, and then let people know about it. And that's where they got the idea of the bandwagoning and appealing to authority really making a difference. And then I think this might be the last, but I think it's a really interesting study. It came out of the Yale Journal of Health Policy from 2005. They were looking at the effects and role of direct-to-physician marketing in the pharmaceutical industry and integrative review. So just bear with me as we read through this, because this is really interesting, because this is somebody from outside the medical field looking in who's quite bemused and bewildered at what they find because it doesn't make sense from a business model. So not only is detailing an important source of information, it affects physician prescribing behavior in a positive and significant manner. More important, this seems to occur over the length of a drug's life cycle. This is puzzling considering that over a drug's life cycle, most information about the drug is likely to be disseminated earlier on, confirmed by physician surveys. Based on our analysis and industry observations, our explanation for this puzzling effect is that in addition to providing a reminder effect, constant interaction with the doctor and the pharmaceutical rep builds a stock of goodwill between a detailer and the physicians, translating into positive physician prescribing behavior. This goodwill is not based on purely objective and rational factors, but on social and cultural norms. Its character changes from informative to more persuasive in the later stages of the drug life cycle. The evolution of goodwill in this manner reflects a deepening relationship between the physician and the pharmaceutical sales representative. So I find this really disturbing. The author did as well, and it underscores why there are problems with these relationships. So that's kind of the end of the psychology part. There are other studies. We could go on forever, but at some point we have to come to a close with that. And let's look at, on the pharmaceutical side, the cost of engagement, because that cost is, like I said, something borne by all of us. So if you look at CIHI data, this is from 2019, public drug costs in Canada were $15 billion. A lot of it is the costly brand name drugs, where there's often a less costly but similarly effective alternative. There's also the cost of marketing to physicians. If you look at public spending, this is prescribed drugs in Canada in 2020. In terms of public drug program spending, the growth was 4.6%. And if you look, a small number of beneficiaries ended up using a lot of the money, and the top of the 3 drug classes were used for rheumatoid arthritis and Crohn's disease, age-related macular degeneration and autoimmune diseases, and prevention of organic transplants with transplant medications. The biologicals become very, very expensive. So a lot of money spent on a few individuals with very expensive drugs. So that's a problem too. Sometimes those are necessary, and that's fine, but the question is, how can you have cost containment? And what about when there are equivalent drugs that are not being used? The last part for the industry is, can industry police itself? That was another issue that came up. There is there's a code of ethical practices for the industry. And I'm sure there are many, many, many industry partners that conform to this and do an appropriate job, but there's also, unfortunately, a lot of examples of those who don't. Be it the whole pharmaceutical marketing with the OxyContin. I'm sure you guys are much more familiar with this than even I am. So there's the opioid crisis. There's fentanyl-based sublingual sprays. The US Department of Justice found a nationwide conspiracy to profit using bribes. Novo Nordisk, where they had, in 2017, settled the US Department of Justice probe where there were paybacks to doctors, where they were disguising salespeople as medical educators. And Biomed paid the US government $3 billion over kickback allegations that the company influenced doctors to use companies' heart pumps. So I think we cannot therefore say that assume that the pharmaceutical company can be the gatekeeper here in terms of avoiding conflicts of interest and inappropriate prescribing. There's also issues about prescribing prices and how many of them have accelerated with different companies. I just let you read this for a second. As a sort of separate issue, particularly in the States, and how that has an impact on Canada, with people coming up to Canada as well to get cheaper alternatives. So far we've looked at the issues with the ways that doctors can be potentially manipulated to prescribe drugs. We've looked at the fact that the drugs companies do not necessarily follow ethical practices, although one would hope the vast majority do, and that there are definitely major prices involved with marketing to doctors and using less expensive, not using less expensive alternatives. So my last little piece here before we go to the examples is, what does the public think? Because the public is important, because if the doctors lose their trust, then they can't really be effective physicians. And the public can actually bring the doctors into line because of this. So in the States, under Obama, they issued the Sunshine Act. They thought that this could reduce healthcare costs because of patients having learned, or their physicians' involvement with industry might alter their view of the physician's trustworthiness. I don't know if this ever actually happened, if anyone ever fired a doctor because they were concerned they were getting too much pharmaceutical involvement. I don't know. There is an interesting Canadian study, though, asking Canadians what they think about physician pharmaceutical industry interactions. And they looked at 1,000 participants in a phone survey across Canada. And they asked them, how acceptable do you think these interactions are? So they thought it was quite acceptable if the doctor requested information about a drug or obtained small gifts of obvious educational value to the patient. So here the patient actually got the gift. So they thought that was okay. Mixed acceptability for free meals to listen to pharmaceutical companies, or if the doctor's paid to attend a conference. And they had very significant concerns. It was not acceptable for the doctor to have research recruitment fees, personal use of medication samples, or for using information not yet public about a new drug to make investment decisions, which I think is probably illegal. So this is, if you're interested, I think this is quite interesting to see what how our patients feel. So certainly even getting into free meals is already becoming of concern to some of them. Okay, finally, is it possible to mitigate conflict of interest? And this would be a great topic on its own. I don't think anyone necessarily knows the answers. Jane here, Dr. Jane, she's a psychiatrist in the States, wrote an interesting paper suggesting if you are going to meet with a pharmaceutical representative, these are ways to structure the interview. You could ask, how does this compare to drug X that I usually prescribe? What are the medication's adverse effects? What is the cost per month? And does a well-controlled study compare it to standard therapy? So these are all questions that you normally wouldn't find out in an interaction with a pharmaceutical representative. So this would be ways to get useful information that won't stop you from being influenced by the coffee that you brought. And it's very hard to say no to a coffee if someone's trying to hand it to you, not because you necessarily really want that coffee, which you may, but it's also difficult from a social perspective to say no to a gift. Then you have the gift and then you're conflicted. So if you decide, I tell the trainees, if you decide to meet with pharmaceutical representative, this is the minimum standard that you should follow. There's also the disclosure slides. Does this help? It at least informs the audience that there are concerns if there are any relevant relationships, potential for conflicts and steps taken to review and mitigate potential bias. I find that number 3 is virtually never done. 1 and 2 are, 1's done, 2 may be done, 3 is virtually never done. And most disclosure slides are up for probably less than a second. So it seems more performative than actually making an influence on the sort of informing the audience. And then there's also studies, which I was talking to Tom about when we had our conversation, that once you're warned about someone's disclosure, you may actually lower your guard and be more likely to be influenced. So hard to know what disclosure slides really do. Then there's the idea of just saying no. Can you just say no? If you suggest that in terms of meeting with reps, being involved with reps, and I have a discussion with the trainees about this, trying not to sound like their mother, but just saying that there are outlining the benefits to not forming any relationships in terms of valuable you become on like guidelines committees, and writing papers. If you can write that you have no conflicts of interest, that really does sadly sets you apart from many of your colleagues, but can give your words a lot of power. We do know, like I said at the beginning, that we all have our own set of biases, but this is one that is avoidable. And I try and encourage them to try and stay away if they can. So then I talked to them about meeting Susan. So your new admin assistant tells you she's booked Susan next from Intel Design to speak to you about the company's product Go Fast. So for each of these, so if I'm teaching a different group, I change the name to be like a cute little clever name of something in their specialty. I've never actually gotten a laugh for this, but I keep trying every time. And I asked them, what do you think the pros and cons are meeting with Susan? And then we chat about it. What are the pros? What are the cons? And then once we come up with our decision, then usually people will say pros, well, you get to get samples. And then we'll talk about samples next. You get to learn more about information. And then someone else will say, well, you can probably get that information somewhere else. And is that really the best way to get the information, et cetera? And hopefully the information that I've told them previously about all the studies will have an influence. Then we review the U of T Faculty of Medicine standards, which state that sales representatives for pharmaceutical and other industries have as an objective the sale of their products. Information they supply about healthcare related to their products should be considered part of their marketing strategy and should not be relied upon as a major source of healthcare information. Meetings between industry product or sales reps and students or trainees should occur only in educational settings when a faculty member is present. The faculty member has a responsibility to ensure that any discussion about specific products is medically and scientifically sound, balanced, and includes alternatives. And I'm not aware of this happening at all anymore at U of T. There may be happening in some subspecialties, but it really become much more limited. They go on that faculty members should model interactions with trainees. If they do faculty decides to meet with reps, it should be by appointment and should not normally take place in the presence of patients unless the representatives are specifically needed for patient care. And sometimes they are because they are the experts in their device or whatever, and they actually are sometimes even needed in the operating room. So that's the first question, and we go through that, and it's quite interesting. I did a session with the vascular residents, the peripheral vascular residents this year, and they were talking about how, like even in their operating rooms, there's only certain types of stents, et cetera, available, and we talked about who makes those decisions, and they will often have the representative in the room to help with the actual process if it's something really complicated. So it's quite interesting how enmeshed those the industry is with respect to the practice of the surgeons. Part two, question two, has to do with drug samples. Mark from Novopill bumps into you in the hallway and hands you a pamphlet on the new statin. So will you be trying out Novoprazole, or can I leave you some sample of Novoprazole for your patients to try? And then we talk about the ethical pros and cons. And this is really kind of a powerful way for the industry to influence prescribing, because if there is not a very sort of agile and reasonable process in place in that province to allow for people who cannot afford drugs to have access to them, then it's very hard as a physician to see somebody who needs a medication not get it, because they're working, but they're very low paid job, and the money they're getting is feeding their children or something like that. So one can see how this can become very attractive to actually help the person survive. We talk about that, then we go back to our drug samples, and we talk about the U of T standards, which is there's several concerns about the use of drug samples provided by the manufacturers to physicians. The fact that the goal of the donor is to develop the market for the drug. It's usually the latest product, may or may not be the best one for the patient. And it's expensive if there's a decision to continue it after the sample's used up. Providing samples to physicians may inappropriately affect their drug of choice because the choice may be based on the availability of the sample, which is certainly true. And then drug safety is a concern, including off-label use, theft, improper storage, use of expired products, lack of proper instruction, and failure to note interactions with other medications. And the point I always make, and I know there's pharmacists in the audience today, is that if you're providing a drug sample, you are bypassing the pharmacist. And a pharmacist is our best friend in terms of making sure that we don't prescribe a drug inadvertently that interacts with another one of their medications. Or even if it doesn't, that pharmacist may subsequently get a prescription in that interacts with the one we're giving the patient, and the pharmacist may not know about it. So it's bypassing the critical role of the pharmacist. Hospitals should consider the establishment of central repositories for drug samples to be administered by pharmacists, which would be great if you can have it happen. Physicians and their families must not use free drug samples that have been given to the physician by industry. It becomes a gift. Physicians who continue to dispense sample drugs must keep appropriate records and ensure the drugs are stored and dispensed in a safe manner. Okay, almost done. We're going to talk about the dinner now, the dinner. And so there's educational events. So we talk about, I didn't put the whole kit and caboodle here, but you're invited to go out for certain rounds at the dinner, and it can be very hard to say no, particularly if you know the speaker is really good. Your only way to get there is, if you accept the industry invitation to the dinner, but then you're going to be conflicted because you're at the dinner and you're having a free meal and it's hard to pay for it on your own, etc. So it really sets up a challenge for physicians who are looking for continuous medical education and how to get that. So centralized, so if U of T faculty, if I decide to run a diabetes CME event, I have to follow certain rules. Even if I'm using industry money, there has to be centralized administration for the content, organization, finances. We have to follow CME accreditation standards and get it accredited. Any checks to speakers are written by U of T, not pharma. We disclose the company's names, not their products. And then there has to be disclosure by the speaker, disclosure of potential conflicts of interest. And then I asked them, what about a sponsored lunch round where the faculty speakers pick their own topics? Is that okay? Or using the calendar with daily tips on how to reduce reflux? Is that good to give your patients? Going golfing in the Bahamas with Susan, which everyone realizes now would be horrified to think about it. But in fact, 20, 30 years ago, this actually happened, right? And what about arranging for accredited CME event and using the pharma money for speakers or program of your choice? So these are all examples which may or may not be allowed under the standards, and we try and sort them out. And we talk about the pros and cons, even if something is allowed, right? Is it really appropriate? Is it in your patient's best interest? That's really the bottom line. And anything that can lead to prescribing bias is not in the patient's interest. Briefly about the gifts, very simple. Gifts must not be accepted. Food and entertainment are considered gifts. And U of T provides an exception for a full day event, like educational event, where the food is modest and part of the budget. This includes rounds, journal club, includes coffees, pens, like anything you can think of. Everything must not be accepted. Then I recap for the trainees. Reflect before you act. Pros: if you're a basic science researcher, like the couple of people that I have who come, one of them discovered a new drug that revolutionized patient care. Maybe, it's worth it. It is worth it. But the cons, if you do develop a relation with industry, you are at risk for influence prescribing, loss of confidence of the public and of your scientific audience if you are writing papers or part of guidelines. So then I ask them to please commit again on paper, and I see if I have shifted them in any way. And that is the end of that. And I'm going to stop now because I've talked for quite a bit of time. There are certain scenarios that I went through with faculty that perhaps another time we could have a good discussion. But ultimately, I ask people to balance what they want, you know, what, where they stand on this topic and how important is it to them to avoid the conflicts of interest. And I hope I've given them enough information to make an educated choice. And that is the end of my talk. I'm happy to take questions, and I see there's something in the chat, and I see Malcolm. And so why don't we start with Malcolm? Malcolm has his hand up.
Thanks very much. Have we any evidence yet that younger physicians who've been exposed to these messages are more resistant to the temptations of industry?
I mean, based on
well, you'd sort of expect the drug visits by drug reps to be a pastime for the elderly physician who managed to escape this, I would hope, fairly effective cultural education or indoctrination. I would hope it would be indoctrination because that's what they get from the industry.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's all sorts of studies we could come up with that would be really interesting to pursue. So I think that would be one that would be right. Like you picture a questionnaire. I don't know how you show that you have, like, whoever's responding to it may be a particular type of doctor that decides to respond to such a thing. But it would be really interesting to know that. I mean, I bet the industry knows that answer, right?
Yeah, of course.
Who's meeting with their drug reps and who isn't. But I have not seen anything. I don't know if anybody else has. Very interesting question, though.
It's Aaron. I did see something, Malcolm, in a paper. I can't remember it offhand now, but there's something about younger physician graduates and how their perception is slightly changed. I'll send it along. After it would be good.
Yeah, I'd like to see it too.
Sure.
Is that what your hand was up for, Aaron, or was there
something? No, actually, I have another couple of comments. Excellent presentation. Thank you so much. It's very well laid out, and it makes your audience walk through an interesting line of stories or concepts to consider. One other thing, just a fun idea, if you ask your students or trainees if the next time they meet a sales rep, if they can offer to buy the rep coffee and see how well that goes. They usually never accept them because I think they have their own internal policies that acknowledge that if you accept gifts, you let your guard down. So that's an interesting social experiment. But I just wonder, like, I've been trying to do this this kind of teaching for a long time, and I just maybe healthcare practitioners are ill-equipped to do this, and I wonder if we should be leaning on people in the social sciences to get a better handle on how do you change behavior, especially when you're dealing with these strong subconscious cognitive bias. Like what I interpret is when you talk to clinicians about this, and I suffered from the same thing, is we feel like we're impervious, right? No, I'm too smart, too educated, too high up the ivory tower to have any of this stuff influencing. Are you kidding? I can see through all that. So maybe we're not the people that know how to change behavior.
Yeah. Thank you, Aaron. So some people had difficulty understanding you. Somehow I think I've got it. So one point you made was offering the rep to buy coffee for them and see what happens. I don't interact with reps, but that sounds like an interesting idea. And then asking social scientists, is there a way to do this, to try and influence behavior? So one thing I think would be really interesting is now we have a new generation, right? We've got the millennials who are out and about, and they are very, very different people compared to Generation X's and compared to baby boomers. And they may be more open to avoiding conflicts of interest. They're very much into, EDI and better, more healthier work-life balance and wellness and such. And I wonder if they would be more open to this. I don't know, but there again, like lots of research questions that could come out of such a discussion. Josh?
Yeah, I think my question might be sort of in the same vein as what Aaron was asking about. I mean, just hearing all this, I think about my partner who's doing her degree in marketing right now, and the kind of material that she shows me in terms of the research that they look at. And I'm wondering, has anyone made an attempt to almost like counterintelligence, like look at what the reps are, what kind of evidence the reps are using to devise their strategies, to optimize their strategies of approaching physicians. And is that a useful sort of thing to look at? Because I would imagine that looks more at sort of psychology research. Marketing is surely developed on a lot of research, and I don't know that's the same sort of quality or vein of research that we use in medicine. So maybe that's social scientists. Similar question to Aaron, I guess.
Yeah. Well, that I sort of tried to get into that a little bit. I've seen there are a few articles out there about that. A lot of it I think is kept under wraps. I tried to do this. Like there's been many, many iterations of this whole thing. My original plan was to see if we could have, would it be helpful to have a centralized patient as a pharmaceutical representative to teach residents the sort of ways that they could be potentially influenced. But then I thought, well, no, that's really kind of supporting the idea of meeting with them in the first place. And probably the best thing to do is to come up with lots of reasons not to meet with the pharmaceutical representative. So it becomes really, really hard, because if you try and present the data, the trainees say they want balance, which is why I bring the researcher in to try and give something positive about research. I tried I found something on YouTube that was an ex pharmaceutical representative talking about what had happened, and it came out that there was a lot of pushback on that. They said this just could be somebody who was angry, and lashing out against their company, and you're giving us left-wing propaganda and blah blah blah. Like, there was a lot of pushback, so it's really hard to know how to do that properly. But I would love ideas, like if your partner has any thoughts about it. The whole thing is just fascinating, right? Like, I don't know, but it's
You
challenging.
have great dinner time conversations.
Yeah, I believe it. Some comments in the chat, mostly that they can't hear Aaron. So Rita asked, any thoughts about the impact or lack of critical appraisal of scientific literature and doctors being the factor? Oh, that's interesting. So hopefully we're teaching people that, right? But if you have that, is that enough to stop the influence? Right? Is that enough? If you have it, you shouldn't need to meet with people. But should you still choose to meet? And sometimes they're looking to meet with the representatives as a means of, because sometimes there are programs for very expensive medications where the representative will help the patient access it with their insurance plans and stuff like that. And that can be very helpful. Or the company will even pay for part of it for certain people. So it becomes hard for doctors not to reach out. That's a very good way of, like, a hook for getting the doctors to go in. So I guess the question is, even if you're perfect at doing the clinical appraisal stuff, is that enough to stop you from being biased? And if it's not, it's a problem with the interaction. If it is, well, then why do you even need the interactions? Because you'll figure it out on your own, right? Did you want to follow up on that at all, Rita?
Well, yeah, one of the things that we do at the TI is we teach them critical appraisal skills. And in one of my roles prior to the TI, I was teaching critical appraisal to family practice residents. And, you know, in family practice, it's a undifferentiated illness. You prescribe almost everything, almost every drug class. There's 1,200 published guidelines in Canada for treatment of diseases. So it's, you know, a fire hose of information. But to our increasing distress, critical appraisal skills seem to be getting worse over time. So just being able to translate, you know, research that's coming out. Anyway, so I don't know, it's complicated. I loved your talk. I think you covered the all of the really key elements of the problem. And I love that you are a voice for this. So thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you.